This is commentary on Lesson 80 in the Workbook for A Course in Miracles. Let me recognize my problems have been solved. Well, this is the last lesson in this current series of 20, and tomorrow we will begin a review. If you remember, going back to the first lesson in this set of 20 was this idea that I'm the light of the world. And in that lesson, he introduced this concept that God's plan for salvation is built upon you and who you really are, which is the light of the world. And that the idea that from who you are comes what your function is, and that function is forgiveness. Forgiveness of this idea of a false self, invented a false self that's without love, and that we look at that performing that function as one giving us peace and joy, that our reality was one in which love created us like ourselves, and that what's holding away from us the memory of who we are is our grievances, and grievances that we project out into the world, and it's those grievances and projections which prevents us from coming inside and seeing who we are. Now, towards this last set of lessons, we've had an emphasis on time. And that's a really key notion in the Course, because it doesn't begin its questioning per se. Well, it does begin its questioning with our false sense of self versus our true sense. But what it pragmatically and practically tries to do is get us focused on our notion of time. So let's look at chapter 13 and see what it has to say about the ego's notion of time. The ego has a strange notion of time, and it is with this notion that your questioning might well begin. So this questioning about who we are, and bringing that concept of false self of who we are to the light, we can begin by looking at what the ego thinks of its notion of time is. And it says the ego invests heavily in the past, and in the end believes that the past is the only aspect of time that is meaningful. So part of what that means is that this invented self, its absence of love, was not a real thing. It didn't happen. But as long as we want that ego, unreal, unloving self to be real, we'll want to stay focused in the past where it seemed to be happening. And along with that seeming act of making up a false self was guilt that came from that. Guilt because it was in violation of the true self that God created, or a seeming violation. And so the ego wants to generate a sense of guilt because that makes it seem to be the act of this making up this false self is real. So remember that the ego's emphasis on guilt enables it to ensure its continuity by making the future like the past and thus avoiding the present. Because in the present, what we're realizing is that's the notion of time we want to begin to understand. And in the Course, the notion of the present is the holy instant. Within the present, within the holy instant, is the forgiveness and miracles that will correct this false notion of self. But from the ego's standpoint, by the notion of paying for the past in the future, and paying for the past means this invention of a false self, it's the past becomes the determiner of the future, making them continuous without an intervening present. For the ego regards the present only as a brief transition to the future, in which it brings the past to the future by interpreting the present in past terms. So here's the idea of focusing on the past and the guilt in the past and making that happen in the future. That This unreal self, which was a desire for a special self of love, was unreal, but we still wanting it to be real, we projected out a world and a body and many, many things that are out there. And so this what seems to make this unreal self seem to be real to us is we continually seek for relationships that will give us our false sense of self. Relationships that are a function of what we've talked about as idle wishes. This idle wish is for a special self of love. And since it's false, it will never work, so there will always be blame associated with it. So from the ego standpoint, it's seeking relationships to actualize this false special self of love. And also in those relationships, it's looking for a way to place its guilt onto those relationships. So focusing on the past and trying to make the future be a function of that past is avoiding the present. And it's the present where the solution to this lies, because it's in the present where the miracles and forgiveness already exist. So beginning to question the illusion of self that's there, this delusional sense of self, we want to begin to explore our notion of time. So that's really important. And so this lesson and the ones just previous are really focused on time, because it's saying that the closest approximation of eternity, of forever, which means forever and eternity means we have a self that remains unchanged. That's what always is true and always will be true. But the reflection of always or eternity, the closest approximation of that right now for us is the present. And that's what we want to custom ourselves. That's the only aspect of time that we want to concern ourselves, is with the present. And being in that present, being present in that present, we will begin to accept the miracles and the forgiveness and the corrections for this false sense of self. So today's lesson is, let me recognize my problems have been solved. So let's go through this lesson. So if you're willing to recognize your problems, you will recognize that you have no problems. Your one central problem has been answered and you have no other. Therefore, you must be at peace. Salvation thus depends on recognizing this one problem and understanding that it has been solved. One problem, one solution. Salvation is accomplished. Freedom from conflict has been given you. Accept that fact and you're ready to take your rightful place in God's plan for salvation. So the rightful place is being the light of the world that now demonstrates the memory of this truer self to ourselves and to others. And that our salvation is recognizing that our only problem was this belief in separation, and that idea has already been corrected. So accepting that, we take our rightful place in God's plan for salvation. Your only problem has been solved. Repeat this over and over to yourself today with gratitude and conviction. You have recognized your only problem, separation, opening the way for the Holy Spirit to give you God's answer. You have laid deception aside and seen the light of truth. You have accepted salvation for yourself by bringing the problem to the answer. And you can recognize the answer because the problem has been identified. You are entitled to peace today. A problem that has been resolved cannot trouble you. Only be certain that you do not forget that all problems are the same. Their many forms will not deceive you while you remember this. One problem, one solution. Accept the peace that this simple statement brings. So that's our perception now, that we have many, many different problems. We have economic problems, we have social problems, we have psychological problems, we have spiritual problems, we have all kinds of problems. Got to get the rent paid today, got to take care of this meeting, got to do this, got to do that. There's just an infinite set. And what we want to do is see all of those as just a defense mechanism to avoid this one problem of separation. And seeing it as one, then we'll accept the solution. So there are many forms will deceive you, while you will not deceive you, while we remember there's one problem, one solution, and accept the peace this simple statement brings. And in our longer practice periods today, we will claim the peace that must be ours when the problem and the answer have been brought together. The problem must be gone because God's answer cannot fail. Having recognized one, you have recognized the other. The solution is inherent in the problem. You are answered and have accepted the answer. You are saved. Now let the peace that your acceptance brings be given you. Close your eyes and receive your reward. Recognize that your problems have been solved. Recognize that you're out of conflict, free and at peace. Above all, remember that you have one problem, and that one problem has one solution. It is in this that the simplicity of salvation lies. It is because of this that it is guaranteed to work. So that's the longer practice periods, claiming the peace that we're entitled to, claiming the reward that we're entitled to, that we are out of conflict, that our only problem of separation has been solved. We've accepted the atonement for ourselves. So in the frequent practices throughout the day, our practices throughout the day, assure yourself often today that your problems have been solved. Repeat the idea with deep conviction as frequently as possible, and be particularly sure to apply the idea for today to any specific problem that may arise. Say quickly, "Let me recognize this problem has been solved." So it's really important that we can practice all through the day as conflicts arise, as problems seem to arise to us. We want to look at those, realizing that behind it is just this one problem of separation, and that problem has been solved. Take those situations, those conflicts, those problems very specifically up and apply this idea. Let me recognize this problem has been solved. Let us be determined not to collect grievances today. Let us be determined to be free of problems that do not exist. The means is simple honesty. Do not deceive yourself about what the problem is, and you must recognize it has been solved. Okay, well, that's it for today. Thank you.